Firstly, thank you to Ranald for the invitation to come here to give this keynote and to run a workshop yesterday, and to all her colleagues who've sorted out my arrangements, because I managed to make life very difficult for them by, instead of just flying in and then flying out again, I spent a week getting here in my camper van with my wife and my dog, spending time camping in the snow in the Harz Mountains, which I loved. We've had a good time, and after today we move on to Berlin. So we've had 2 weeks over here rather than just fly in and fly out. So it has made life difficult for people. Apologies for those who may want to speak to me over lunch. I speak no German at all. My wife does, so, but she's not with me at the moment. Also, I have no script to give you afterwards, because I make it up as I go along. I have a series of pictures and slides, and if I have a script, I get bored. So you will get bored. So I just ad-lib as we go along. I like to tell stories, to use pictures, to use metaphors. I often use music, though I won't be doing so today. But what I want to do, there's one of my dogs who's here with me this week, the other one unfortunately died. But this is very near my home in Derbyshire. What I'm interested in about the scholarship of academic development is that, yes, I have written about it, but the scholarship is something you do. It's something you do every day. It's not just something you say that, well, we might be scholarly about what we do. It's how we carry out our practice as academic developers. So what I'm going to do today is tell you a few stories about how I made my practice more scholarly by the things I did. And 3 things I want to look at in looking at academic development and the scholarship of academic development is firstly, very briefly, what is academic development, because I define it very broadly rather than narrowly to people in a department, a special department. A little bit about scholarship, because there are many definitions of that. But particularly, I want to dwell on what is the scholarship of academic development, because that's the title of the talk. One of the problems in a lot of the literature is that people define academic development as either staff development, faculty development in the United States in particular, educational development, as has been the case in the UK, academic development, organisational, professional development. So why not just call it academic development, which is what you've tended to do and what we've started to move towards much more in the UK, and is happening in Australia and New Zealand. And lots of people have written about academic development. Some time ago, Beecher and Trowler looked at academic tribes and territories, and we were looking at whether academic development was a tribe in its own right and had its own territories and its literature and so on. What Stephen Rowland wrote was that you could define it as the field of teaching in higher education. And it's that I'll go on to look at. Using a quote from Ranald from Norway, he says, and this is why I think academic development applies to everyone in this room, because everyone in this room is involved in the sorts of things on this slide. If you're not, I wonder why you're here, but I think you are involved in the things on this slide. So, it refers to activities in an academic institution to improve the quality of its education. Thank you. It is particularly related to activities that involve the academic faculty in their educational functions. It also involves working at an institutional level with structures and functions. So it goes beyond just academic staff, and it goes beyond just how we manage learning and teaching, because it does involve the structures in place in a university, in an institution, the processes for bringing about change in learning and teaching, the libraries, the technology infrastructure we have, all those things are part of improving the quality of education in a university. That is academic development. And that's the definition I want to work with today. Okay. I did an activity in the workshop yesterday, which I'd never done before. I just made it up as we went along. And someone said it was a bit like the elevator talk, where you're in a lift, in an elevator, and someone says, "What do you do?" And you've got 30 seconds till the elevator gets to the top to describe what your job is. And someone sitting next to you says, "Hello, tell me what you do." I'm an academic developer, and that means that you have about a minute to talk to someone next to you to describe what you do, that makes what you do academic development. Go. There should be a buzz in the room. What I say often depends on who I'm talking to, how long I've got in the lift, whether the person works in a university or not. The one that works well if I'm talking to someone, if they don't work in a university, is to say, part of my job is to help university teachers teach better. They love that, because they say that a lot of them need that help. I then go on to explain a lot more than that about how I actually do that, and that is only a part of what we do. But there are lots of different stories we can tell about how we're trying to bring about those improvements in education, in learning and teaching, in structures and policy in universities. But just think about that. A lot of people, a lot of policy makers in particular, certainly in the UK, still have a problem in distinguishing between scholarship and research. And this was helped, or the situation was helped by the work of Ernest Boyer in the United States, who broadened out definitions of scholarship away from just research, integration and engagement to look at the scholarship of teaching and learning. And there's a huge movement in the United States in particular that's become much more international that looks at the scholarship of teaching and learning. It has to be said that some of us feel some of the techniques being used are, I was going to say poor, that's unfair, but need a little bit more rigor in them to become a bit more research-like at times, to be more applicable. But the work was elaborated by Rice and Schulman in the United States, where looking at how scholarship involves communities of engagement. A writer, Etienne Wenger, has done a lot of work around communities of practice. If you've never read Wenger's work, I think it's well worth it, Blaven Wenger's book on it as well, because I think many of us engage in communities of practice. A lot of people try and form communities of practice, like committees, and that doesn't work. They need to come together because people have a shared interest, want to develop an understanding about a particular thing. In this case, the thing is a scholarship of learning and teaching. What makes what we're doing in learning and teaching or academic development more scholarly? And what Lee Andressen in Australia wrote about was that some of the characteristics of scholarship are firstly critical reflectivity as a sensibility, a habit of mind. Whatever we're doing, we should be reflecting on what we're doing and being able to change the whole time. Those of you who encountered Schoen's work on reflection will know about reflection. Once you've done a class or run a workshop, reflection on action, what you've done. And then before you do the next activity, reflection for action. One bit that people should perhaps concentrate a little bit more on is reflection in action. So I'm watching all of you, because the lights aren't too bright. and I can see how many have fallen asleep or nearly fallen asleep and whether I need to do something to wake people up. So I'm reflecting the whole time in what I'm doing in my practice to see what activity I need to do next, how I need to move on to engage people a little bit more. So it's that reflection in action as well. And we need to put our practice up for scrutiny. We need to allow other people to question what we're doing. Now, publication is the main way that happens, whether it's in refereed journal articles or in magazines, in newspapers. Two of my most successful articles have been in the Times Higher Education Supplement, which is a magazine in the UK, and the other one was quoting me widely in Reader's Digest. That had the most impact because a lot of, or not the most, it had a big impact because a lot of non-academics read it. And I was writing about plagiarism. And something of interest to all of us, no doubt, but people were interested in the fact that we were treating plagiarism as a serious topic that had to be dealt with in universities. And the fact that it was written up in Reader's Digest was quite unusual. And the fact about inquiry. A lot of people use the term research, but I prefer the term inquiry. That the whole time we're inquiring, we're asking questions about what we're doing, trying to find out how to do things better or differently. And that's, for me, the way in which we should be structuring the way of learning for our students. That their learning should be through inquiry, rather than through a very formal teaching them topics in a very didactic way, but rather, and I just realized didactic is used in a different sense in the UK, often from on the continent, but a straight delivery of content. So inquiry is very important to me. I just, again, like you to take a minute talking to your colleague to think, how do you reflect scholarship in your own practice as an academic developer or someone who's trying to improve learning and teaching or education in your institution? And perhaps the word inquiry is the key to that. So just take a couple of minutes talking to your neighbor again. How do you promote or how do you engage in scholarship in your practice? Go. The other thing I like to use, I'm not going to ask you to do the task here. The other thing I quite like to use are cartoons. And this one, often, yes, I can hear people realizing what it means. But it's an important experience for a lot of teachers that they think they've taught a topic really well and no one's understood it. No one's learned anything. In the workshop yesterday, we were talking about some work by Tom Angelo and Pat Cross from the United States called Classroom Assessment Techniques. And classroom assessment techniques are where you find out in every class what your students are learning, or in a workshop, what the participants are getting from it. So, for example, at the end of a lecture or a class, you ask students to write down what they thought were the 3 main points of the lecture. You then collect them in and realize they were all at a totally different place from you, if you're unlucky. If you've got it right, they get down what were the main points, not just because you wrote them down and said, this is what the lecture is about. Or you ask them to write down what were the 3 muddiest, least clear points. And you collect them in, and at the beginning of the next session you say, it's obvious that some of this wasn't clear. I'm going to explain this because you need to understand this before we can move on. The other one that someone mentioned yesterday that Tom Angelo and Pat Cross use is the 1-minute essay, where at the end of a session, you give people 1 minute to write an essay about the session, and you collect them in. And those are fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Really interesting accounts, again, of what you thought you were teaching or what you thought you were trying to get over in a workshop. And I'm not going to use that technique at the end of this keynote. Perhaps I should. Okay, what I want to do now is to give a number of case studies of situations where, in my own practice as an academic developer, on reflection, and sometimes before it happened, I was acting what I think was a scholarly way. And so what I've tried to do is just develop a very simple little model that I'm going to use, where firstly, I had to be clear what the issue was. What is it we are looking at? Secondly, as a result of this, what questions begin to arise? Because the best research happens when you get the questions right. And so I wasn't trying to just say, we're going to do some research or we're going to do something for the sake of it. It was because we had some serious questions we wanted to ask. Having done the research or the scholarly activity and got the results of that, or looked at a particular theory we might want to use, we began to think, what can we do about it? And having done that, reflect on the outcomes of our action. And then, has the situation been resolved? And if not, we have to go round again and keep going round until we think we resolve the situation. The reality is we never completely resolve the situation. We have to perhaps go off in different directions. So, the first example I'm going to use is at Sheffield Hallam University, we were having real problems with assessment practices and policy, with students becoming very strategic about the way they carried out assessments, and at times, too many students failing a small piece of assessment and therefore failing the whole module or course. And that was a waste of resources in many respects, because with a bit of help, a change in approach, they could demonstrate their learning in a different way, and we didn't have to make them resit the whole course, the whole module. And so what we were trying to do was look at why there had been so many changes to assessment, so many projects to try and change assessment, so many policies from university managers, and they didn't work. I apologize in advance to university managers because I'm going to make some comments that as I did yesterday. But I think sometimes we feel that a policy is going to lead to a particular outcome. The thing about many academics is they're very good at subverting policies. I remember working with a course in Singapore, and this institution in Singapore said they had introduced problem-based learning. And I went and looked at it, and I thought, this doesn't look like problem-based learning to me. So I spoke to them, and I said, aren't you doing problem-based learning? Oh, yes, the management say we are doing problem-based learning, so we are doing problem-based learning. And it bore no resemblance. And this is what was beginning to happen with assessment. And so I was interested in why a policy, certain actions, didn't lead to a particular outcome. A project, and we all love projects, and in the UK, we've had projects, educational change projects for years and years, and many institutions have shelves full of final reports and no change, or little change, because maybe it didn't go wide enough, it didn't affect enough people, it didn't change the culture of the institution. And so I became interested in the literature on change. And if you put my name into Google Scholar and look up some of the articles I've written, there's a lot on change and change management, change leadership you'll find there. So I became interested in looking at change and complexity. And in particular, that change is not linear. It isn't this will happen, this is how we do it, this is the outcome. That universities are very complex organizations made up of lots of individual agents, individual people, often in little groups of subjects or administrative teams or whatever. And so change is very, very complex within a situation like that. And the outcomes can be very, very uncertain. It's like, economic policy in all our countries at the moment. The finance ministers may say this is what's going to happen, and they hope what they say is going to happen will, but it rarely happens in the way they've anticipated. It's the same as is true of policy in universities. And what I wanted to do was, at Sheffield Hallam University, was set up something called the Assessment for Learning Initiative, TALI. And it was going to be a whole institution-wide change initiative that involved everyone, including students. And we had students walking around with T-shirts saying, are you getting enough feedback on your learning? We did all sorts of silly things, but it was just to raise the whole profile of what we were doing. I apologize for this next diagram. But, and I tried to explain it in the workshop yesterday, but what it's saying is that if you're down at the bottom left-hand corner, where you are close to, everyone agrees about what needs to be done, and you are close to certainty, if you do something, you know what is going to happen. If you are there, you are in a simple situation, and that's the way many change initiatives work. People think if we do this, the outcomes will be certain, and we're all close to agreement. In a non-educational setting, one of the examples given is following a recipe in a cookbook. That it's been tried and tested so many times that if you follow it carefully, the outcome will be similar on most occasions, unless you do something very silly. The next move along the axes takes us to a situation where there's less certainty and less agreement on what's going to happen. And we get into what's called an area of complication. So we've moved from simple to complicated. And again, the example given there might be building a car or a space rocket. One individual can't do it, involves teams specializing in different areas. It has to fit together properly. It becomes much more complicated. And then we move into the zone of complexity, where the outcomes are much less certain and there's much less agreement on what's going to happen if we carry out certain actions. Now, if we go too far out there, we end up in a situation of chaos or anarchy. So what we're trying to do is keep within the zone of complexity or the edge of chaos. And that's the area of greatest innovation, creativity, risk-taking, and fun. That's where it's most enjoyable, being in there, not knowing what's going to happen, and where very strict management techniques of planning and control, measurement and evaluation don't work so well. They have a role, but they don't work so well, because what you need to do in an organization is allow people to talk to each other, and the term that's used is that change emerges. It comes out of people talking to each other. And the example I gave you about trying to change assessment in a university came about through me talking to an assistant dean in a faculty of law in a coffee bar. And we had quite a few coffee bar conversations. And we started inviting more people in, senior people, teachers, all sorts of people, to join our conversations. And in the end, we wrote a university paper that became university policy that everyone bought into because they'd been part of writing it. It hadn't come from on high down onto us, and we were being told to do it. we all understood, and that the change to the culture of the university came about through everyone discussing it and the change emerging. In the zone of complexity, the example given outside education is bringing up a child. Bringing up a child is a very complex procedure. It's not complicated, it's not simple, it's complex. The outcomes are uncertain, they're challenging, they're unpredictable, they hopefully should be fun. It's interesting though, I've said in simple was baking a cake, complicated was building a car or a space rocket, getting the bits together, complex raising a child. In certain cultures, in some Asian cultures, they would say raising a child is simple, but cooking is complex, because cooking is an art, and it involves your soul and your being. It's very different from raising a child. Raising a child, for some cultures, there are rules. If you follow them out, follow the rules, the outcomes are certain. I'll leave you to reflect on that one, those of you who have children. So, that's my first example. How do you bring about change at an institutional level in assessment policy? It can be anything else. We've done it on how to introduce more inquiry into the curriculum as well. We'll come to some other examples in a minute. Okay. The second one was, I was approached by a senior administrator, the senior administrator in the university, who said, we're very worried that with the growth of the internet, the amount of plagiarism that's happening is growing. So people are just copying texts from Wikipedia, or there are lots of websites out there that will sell them essays or answers to problems. How do we deal with that? And I could have said, we make the regulations much stricter so that if we catch them, we punish them more. And what effect would that have had? None at all. Because so many people will try and break those rules and not understand why we saw plagiarism as an issue. So that became the question. I was able to employ a research assistant who spent quite a bit of time interviewing groups of students, groups of staff in different subjects at different levels, and worked with another research professor to analyze the data, and then worked with senior administrators to try and look at how do we change policy and practice and the curriculum to reduce the amount of plagiarism. The first thing we did was to stop talking about plagiarism. We started talking about academic integrity and people adopting good academic skills. And we said that in the first year, they should come with all those skills from school. They don't. So we had to look at how to make sure that in the first year of all our courses, students became aware of good academic practice. How to read journals and books. How to attribute and reference what they'd been reading. How to put arguments together from what they were reading. And not just copy big chunks of other literature. And the research showed us very interesting things. Some of the students said they wanted to come from a university where people didn't think that some people got their degrees by cheating. They wanted to come from a university where everyone thought they'd got their degree fairly and had to work hard for it. And there are some universities around the world where that's not the case. There was a big case a few years ago at Newcastle University in Australia that had a franchise in Indonesia, I think it was. And there was a lot of plagiarism there because the university hadn't treated it seriously. A lot of staff felt that it was too much time
to try and deal with plagiarism. And so they didn't. Or they just failed students. So they didn't look at the degree of plagiarism and why it was happening. So the research, and the research is published in quite a few journals, led to a university working group. We held various conferences or went to conferences. We published journal articles. We did research. Before we changed policy and changed practice, we did the research. We felt we acted in a fully scholarly way. We just didn't just say, plagiarism is a problem, we'll make the penalties harsher. Because we didn't think that would work. Having done the research, having shared it with other people, we then looked at the policies and procedures, the curriculum changes we needed to make, and had very clear criteria about what was plagiarism, what was minor plagiarism, and what was serious plagiarism, and had the penalties to deal with different levels. And so in the first year of a course, most plagiarism was actually poor study skills. Students didn't know how to take notes, how to reference, and so failing them wasn't good. Didn't feel right, because what we had to do was help them to gain those skills. In the final year, students plagiarizing, they were cheating. And we dealt with them as cheats. And we didn't change the language there. We called it academic misconduct, to be nice about it. Academic misconduct, but it was cheating. And so we had to deal with it as such. But we had lots of exchanges of students coming in from different countries and different courses, and they might not have come into our culture or experienced our culture before, and suddenly they come in and find that what they'd been allowed to do somewhere else. We found this particularly with large groups of Chinese students coming into the UK, that the understandings of quoting an expert in the field were different in some cultures than from other cultures. So what happened as a result of our research, our scholarly approach, that instead our approach to plagiarism, there was more emphasis on good practice and academic integrity. And I think that was really important because a lot of the media, the press, had big headlines about students cheating in large numbers. Was it Harvard recently? There was a big case in the media about a computer science course, I think, where students were caught plagiarizing. And so we felt we want our university to be a place that doesn't happen. Let's be honest, we don't want to be on the front page of the newspapers for the wrong reasons. Yeah, we'd like to be there for the right reasons. But. The third example, in the United Kingdom, the Funding Council put a lot of money, something like 400 million euros, into what they called Centres for Excellence in Learning and Teaching. There were 74 of these, and so they got a lot of money. And that money was over 5 years. And the point about these Centres for Excellence was that because it was 5 years, and most project funding had been for 2 or 3 years, it was to give time for real change to happen. And myself and a colleague put in a bid for one of these Centres for Excellence, and we got it. And we became co-directors of what was called the Centre for Promoting Learner Autonomy. And for us, learner autonomy was about students taking greater responsibility for their own learning. It wasn't independent learning. It was where students took greater responsibility for their learning and worked together much more with other students and with us and with employers and with other people. The problem we had is that our pro-vice-chancellor, pro-rector, something like that, was very into management techniques. So he wanted us to have very detailed plans, very strict monitoring. We had to explain why we deviated from plans, and the outcomes had to be as we'd written in the bid for this Centre for Excellence. And we nearly resigned, but we said, well, we'll do some of that, but because this is about autonomy, we want to give people in our Centre for Excellence autonomy. So we're not going to tell them what to do all the time. We're going to give them freedom pardon me, to try things out. So they wanted, the senior manager wanted us to manage, we wanted to lead. And we saw a distinction in the two, that we were leading a big change initiative. They wanted us to manage a strict project. So we didn't tell them everything we did. We just got on with subverting the system. But what we did do was run parallel systems. It worked. But what we did is that we started using a lot of alternative approaches to evaluation. Traditionally, evaluation, finding out how things have worked, are about measuring what's happened, about describing it, about making judgments about whether it had worked or not. I mean, it was very, and it was outside people that would do that. We wanted evaluation to happen inside what we were doing. So we wanted everyone to be responsible for evaluation. So we used something called fourth generation evaluation. If you've never encountered that, it's worth going and looking for it. Goober and Lincoln have written a lot about it. And it's about evaluation from the point of view of all those involved in it, not just the people who funded it. And I'll come back to that again in a minute. And what we wanted to do was have a much more open, collegial approach with everyone working as partners. So we were working with the literature in that previous blob, and with communities of practice, and saying to our manager, we're not just doing this because it's a nice idea, we're doing it because the literature on the new literature on evaluation, on communities of practice, on learner autonomy, suggests that if we do this, it will bring about significant change. And we feel it did. One of the things, a few years ago, I ran a course for new teachers in higher education, and the course was on adult learning, how adults learn. And the first thing we did was take them into a children's nursery and said to them, watch how these children learn. And I asked the question yesterday in the workshop, but what is the question all students, all little children ask that we would like our students to ask all the time? Why? And students ask, little children ask why all the time. They're inquiring. They've got an inquiry form of learning. Sometimes that's dangerous because they touch things that burn them. But what they're doing is asking why. What do you mean by that? How did you, and then it gets more sophisticated. Where did you get the data for that? How do you explain that? But you can see that, so I've often felt, let's look at little children learning and think how we can bring that into what we're doing in higher education. Because it's that, the fun. I think the looks on their faces show what it would be nice to have in our classrooms every week, for those who are still awake. So, and what we did with this Centre for Promoting Learner Autonomy, we tried to have fun as well. And so, though the person on the right looks a bit apprehensive, because I think he was chosen to explain what this was, and I don't think he was really clear. but he was told, no, it's your turn. You didn't put it together. You can explain it. But when we found we'd become a centre for excellence, we thought, how can we play? How can we try things out? So we involved students, staff, administrators, technical staff. And as part of that, some of you may have encountered the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. Pardon me. Started in the United States, but now has spread worldwide. It's had conferences all over the world. And we took 2 students from 2 of our courses at Sheffield Hallam to this conference. And it's the young lady second from the left and the other one second from the right. They're the 2 students we took with us. The young lady second from the right was from our Students' Union. She was an officer in the Students' Union. The person on the left, he was co-director with myself, and the chap in the middle was the conference organizer. These 2 students were in a panel of lots of students from American universities, and the American students sat behind their desk talking into a microphone. Ours stood up here and acted out what they wanted to say. They said, we've been given the chance now to talk to academics about what it's like to be a student. We're going to use that opportunity. The audience had 700 people in it. These were 2 students who'd never spoken in front of a large group before. At the end of what they'd said, everyone stood up, and they thought it was to walk out. But they all stood up to applause the 2 students. Up till then in the conference, they'd stayed with us the whole time because they felt insecure. We didn't see them again because everyone wanted to talk to them. And so what we'd done is give them their freedom, their autonomy, if you like, to take on the responsibility of speaking, having a voice about what it was like to be a student on a course at their university, where we were trying to give them greater responsibility for their learning. And I can't stress enough what, for us, was the power of involving students in what we did. Because we sometimes forget that we're here for the learner, not the teacher. Right? We're really here to change the lives of the learners. And that's what we should be focusing on, because higher education can change lives, particularly if you work with mature or non-traditional learners. Some of you were at this conference. I know Thomas was, 1 or 2 others were in Sheffield. It's the International Consortium for Educational Development. It's held every 2 years, and it's a conference of organizations like your German body, CEDA in the UK. This conference in Sheffield was supposed to have been held in Sri Lanka. But because of the fighting, it couldn't. It was too dangerous. So it was moved to Sheffield. Sri Lanka, Sheffield. Anyway, people came. About 250 people came. And I won't ask you to I won't point them out, but 2/3 of the people, this was the organizing committee, and 2/3 of the people on that picture are students. They took major roles in organizing the conference. They'd done so all the way through up till then, and they'd used to telling eminent professors what they were doing was wrong, or how to do it better, because they had the practice by then. Okay, the final example I'm going to give, I retired from full-time work 3 years ago. I have to stress it was early retirement. I was only 57 at the time. So I retired from full-time work to do all the other things I wanted to do, but also to do more freelance work. And one of the projects I was asked to do was to go as a consultant to one university that was a new university, a lot of new staff. It was having problems getting people to work together. And it wanted to write a learning and teaching strategy. Every university in the UK has to have a learning and teaching strategy. And for quite a number of years, it got significant funding for the learning and teaching strategies to put them in place. So the sorts of prizes you were giving earlier, that sort of thing would happen through our learning and teaching strategies. Having posts, academic development posts in each faculty or department was funded by this. But this new university wanted me to go in and help them write a learning and teaching strategy. Many learning and teaching strategies had been written by academic development departments or by senior managers. You can imagine how well that went. Because no one owned it. They didn't feel it was theirs. So what this university wanted me to do was help them write something that they owned, that was part of what they felt. And so I used it, I'll give you some references to some of this later. I used a technique called open space technology, which I meant, how many of you have encountered open space technology? Yeah, quite a few actually. That's interesting. I've used it quite a lot. Open space technology, forget the technology. Open space is where you run a session where there's a very strong theme that you're working to, and people almost self-organize within it to address particular issues, to come up with actions and responsibilities and so on. And I've used it over 24 hours with faculties at Sheffield Hallam University very successfully, where people have developed their own strategy for their faculty, and it's had their headed faculty, administrative and technical staff, professors, junior academics, and they said to me afterwards there was no sense of hierarchy in the room because everyone had something to contribute. The technician would say, if you do this that way, it won't work. The finance officer said, you can't afford it. And the dean said, if that's what you want to do, I will make sure you have the resources to do it. Not often, but they sometimes did. And so you needed everyone in there. And so by using open space technology, what happened was everyone developed a set of, over a full day, a set of principles for the university to underpin learning and teaching. So some of the principles might be that they recognize diversity, a diverse range of approaches to learning, that people learn in different ways. And so the curriculum had to reflect that. So that was at the university level. We had about 70 or 80 people in a room for the day who developed a set of principles using open space. I then went in and worked with each faculty individually and said, we have a set of principles. They're not mine. They're not your dean's. They came from the university. And so they are owned by the university. How are you going to use those to develop your own strategy for your faculty? And that's what happened. They developed their own strategies. They were all different, but they all had the same principles that informed them. So the health faculty was different from the science faculty, which was different from the business faculty, because they had different important areas of focus. But the same principles underpinned them all at a university level. Pardon me. Okay, so what I've done in those case studies is just use some examples of different approaches to scholarly activities in the things I've done. And what I've done on this slide is just highlight some of the techniques we used. The first one is appreciative inquiry. A lot of research tries to find out why or evaluation is often trying to find out why things have gone wrong. Appreciative inquiry focuses on the things that have worked. the things that give strength, the things that give power to an organization. So it looks at the positive things. And the person, if I've put my email on the end, if anyone's interested in any of the references, I can send them to you afterwards, just get in contact. But the person here is David Cooper-Ryder and his colleagues, and there's some really interesting stuff there. The next one's a much more recent approach to evaluation. It's called developmental evaluation, and it's ongoing. It happens as you're working through a developmental activity. And Michael Patton, who's done a lot of work on using evaluation that can be used, isn't just a judgment, but is usable. Michael Patton's done a lot of work on developmental evaluation. I find it very useful. If you're interested in open space technology, it's Harrison Owen. He did a lot of his work in South Africa, in immediate post-apartheid South Africa, and with groups in the United States where there were tensions with Native American and other groups, and how do you bring those groups together? So working in the university seems easy after some of those. And the final one is action research. Jean McNiff is one writer here. You'll have others that you can look into. I'm going to put 5 quotes up on the screen. When you know who they're from, can you put your hand up? All right, I've got one hand. And think about the quotes. Don't just identify them. Think about the quotes. Still only one hand. Still the one hand. Oh, a second hand. Right, third. This is a good one for quality, people. Okay, anyone else? One of those? Yes, who is it? Who are the quotes from? If you want to source a great quote, go to Albert Einstein. There's a massive quotes there. But don't just take them as quotes. Think about what they're saying, because I think there's some very powerful things in there. It's a miracle that curiosity survives formal education is a very worrying quote. So, just the last couple of slides. What are the challenges that face us as academic developers? The first one is to demonstrate the impact and the effectiveness of what we do. If we're in a specialist department, we cost money. So we have to justify to the university, to the institution, why they should pay for us. That we should promote the scholarship of learning and teaching and not just disciplinary research. In my institution, we have professors of engineering education, of legal education, of social science education, and so on. These are people who are doing research into the teaching of and learning in their discipline, not just research into their discipline. So they become professors for understanding, researching and understanding and sharing what it means to be a good learner in law or engineering. So they're scholarly in their practice. And what we try and do is work at that level, try and encourage that scholarship with everyone who teaches. Academic practice is more than just learning and teaching. It is about research. So an interesting question I asked yesterday was, how do your policies in the university align with each other? How does the learning and teaching policy align with the research policy, with the estates policy, with the human resources policy, in a way that perhaps allows someone to be a researcher, a teacher, a course leader, all those things, and have the promotion prospects for them? There's a real challenge. That we're all going to face the situation where we have to implement policies we don't agree with. And I joked about subverting it earlier. You can't do that all the time. You sometimes have to find ways of providing evidence that there is a better alternative. And if you can't do that, you sometimes have to just get on with implementing the policy you don't like, because hopefully someone has found the evidence for it. We have to establish our academic credibility. This has been a real problem for a lot of new academic developers, in that they say the academics don't treat us as equals. Certainly in the UK now, there are many professors of academic development, and there is much research and publication. There are specialist journals in academic development. That's how you start to establish the credibility and can have the conversations about academic research and scholarship with subject people. And we did discuss yesterday about the extent to which you have separate central departments of academic development and the extent to which they're distributed out into the faculties. There is a growing move to have a smaller central department and distributed academic developers in faculties who come back into the centre for a day or two a week for their professional development and to have a shoulder to cry on and all sorts of things. This was a workshop I was running in Sri Lanka. The day we ran it, the Minister of Finance was assassinated 2 blocks away. These were people who were traveling 24 hours to get to a half-day workshop through a war zone. And I just felt it was really important to share how easy our experiences can be at times to partake. And we shouldn't take being here or engaging in academic development activities for granted, because some people have it really tough to get there. One person in that photo, the chap on the back right, one day he was leaving work with a colleague. They were told to take a different way home. He did, his colleague didn't, and was assassinated. That was the world they were living in. How do we make ourselves valuable? Provide research and evidence to support policy. Right? Get in there, provide the evidence. You may have generated it, but that's what we should be doing. Engage with and lead consultations. That's part of the providing evidence. Prepare papers for committees. I said yesterday, lots of managers and administrators love having solutions to problems. Provide the solutions. Provide a community for scholars. Many institutions now have lunch. People find it difficult to find the time to get together. Every 2 weeks, say we are going to meet for lunch in this place, bring your lunch and bring an article you want to discuss. Or here's an article we're going to discuss about problems with assessment or teaching big groups or whatever. Come together and you organize it. You don't have to be, that doesn't take a lot of organizing. Be challenging, take risks, and be a critical friend. Promote a holistic notion of academic practice. Seek out the best practices from elsewhere. One of the things that was happening in my workshop yesterday was people were talking to each other a lot of the time. They were getting ideas from other people. Gunnar Handel finishes by saying, acting as a critical friend is acting academically. It involves a relationship of confidence and trust and empathy. Empathy is perhaps the important word on there. That you have a sense, you can identify with the fears, the problems the other person is having. I'm just going to put these up. A lot of that is already happening in Germany. I think that is very important. It's happening worldwide. That we should act as a community in ourselves. In the UK, we have the UK Staff and Educational Development Association, and we have a fellowship scheme of an associate fellowship, a fellowship, and a senior fellowship based on these values. And the final quote from Liz Beattie, who was co-chair of CEDA with me, research into higher education development is an imperative if we are to change higher education for the better. The primary role for professional academic and staff developers is to forge links between educational research and development. So we should be carrying out the research and thinking how we could, where that takes us in the future. That was close.